Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. You're about to listen to a great conversation I had with Dr. Austin Freeman involving his book, Tolkien Dogmatics. In that book, Dr. Freeman develops a systematic theology of J.R.R. Tolkien's thought. It's a great read. Unfortunately, like so many academic books, it has the problem of being prohibitively expensive. But Austin's publisher wants to help you out. They have offered up 3 copies of Austin's book as a giveaway. Here's how the game works. Between the day this episode drops and July 1, we are running a contest in order to give away 3 copies of Tolkien Dogmatics. So, how do you play the game? You go to your copy of The Silmarillion or Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. You find your favorite passage from that and you type that out as a quote in the comments underneath this episode on YouTube. Now, if you're watching on X, you need to navigate over to YouTube, find the Optimistic Curmudgeon, and enter that as a comment on YouTube. At the end, on July 1, I will go back through and find everybody who did, in fact, play this game correctly. And I'll put their names into a hat. I will draw 3 names, and I'll reach out to those folks over YouTube reply and in order to forward their information on to the publisher. So if you are interested in winning a copy of Austin's book, what do? You got to find your favorite quotation from The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, or The Silmarillion, and drop that in on the comments. We'd love to fill YouTube with comments from Tolkien's writing. And now, on to this week's episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon.
I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Austin Freeman, Assistant Professor of Apologetics and Department Chair of Apologetics at Houston Christian University. Austin is the author of Tolkien Dogmatics, Theology Through Mythology in Middle-earth. Austin, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I've been advertising this show today, telling people that if they are tired of the election, they should tune in to hear us talk about permanent things instead. And I'm going to slightly violate that because we are recording on election day. And I say you two have your I voted sticker, it looks like. So just in case this is the end of democracy as we know it, it being November 5th, 2024, what are your thoughts on the election and so on? And then we'll get to Tolkien and the important stuff.
Might be a very, very different reason to remember the 5th of November. Who knows? Let's hope there's no explosions. It's been a very stressful time. And I mean, I remember back when I was a little kid, the first election that I remember was Bill Clinton and Al Gore, I suppose. And I remember feeling that it was so weird that Clinton was not the president anymore. Right. Because as a little kid, he'd been in there for a really long time. And that's who I thought was the president. I thought that's who the president had always been, naive kid stuff. And even on into college and elsewhere, it seems like it didn't feel like this before. And nowadays it's like, wow, we really do this every 4 years. This is exhausting. Let's hope that we're moving in a more positive direction as a country. But what I do think the benefit is a lot more people are caring about the process than have before. The voter turnout is obviously usually very dismal, but it hasn't been in the last few federal elections, which is a good thing in the abstract, right? Regardless of whether your team wins or not, you do want people to actually participate. But I over the summer, I went back through and read a lot of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. Just because I presume I read them in my AP US history course in high school, but I didn't remember any of them. It's shocking, you've got this speech that Patrick Henry makes in like 1784, already talking about we've lost the American spirit. And this is Patrick Henry, right? Like he was there.
Yep.
But it is pretty interesting to think of. Everybody's talking about there's never been a golden age, right? You've got the people in Acadia talking about, oh, kids these days, they never want to just sit down and read a tablet or whatever it is. So people have always been people. It's good to be reminded of that. It's also good to be reminded that God is always God. And so the king that is actually ruling is going to continue to rule regardless of who wins the election.
Well, I think that's a great place to be. I mean, I feel like I did my civic duty. I went. Fortunately, I've just had this compulsion to not vote early.
Mhm.
Everyone has been telling me to vote early, and Kamala has texted me, and Donald has texted me. They both pretend to be my friends, and they want my vote as quickly as I'll cast it. I walked into my first class this morning, sort of ready to give a bit of a harangue, and as I actually started class, I realized that wasn't actually what I wanted to do. I just wanted to remind my students that politics seems to come and go.
Mhm.
And the things that we're actually here to study in Western Civ 1 and then in philosophy of education and in their literary master's classes, the things that we're actually here to study in college, these are the things that last. And
Mhm.
I was just struck by the fact that even though it does seem to me to be a more dire case this year than in, say, 2016 or 2012 or 2008, every election that I can remember has been the most important election
Yeah.
of everyone's lifetime. And I'm just like, I'm kind of done with the rhetoric. And so I am confident that God is still God, and one day the true King will return, and we are still under His reign, but we are not yet in the fullness of that reign. But He
Yeah.
will return, and his
Somebody should
church
write a
will
book with
endure.
that title.
You'd think, which is probably a hopefully not too awkward segue to your book and our actual topic today. Could you tell us a little bit of the story behind Tolkien dogmatics and some of your story? How'd you get into teaching apologetics? Does that have any connection to this book? Help us know a little bit about you and about your book.
Sure. Well, I think like many people, at some point when I was a fairly young preteen kid, I got handed a copy of The Hobbit, and somebody said, "Hey, I think you'll like this." Usually it spreads by word of mouth. And so I picked it up, and lo and behold, I did like it. And I read The Hobbit, and then I read The Lord of the Rings, and I read The Silmarillion, and then I read Unfinished Tales, and I read all this stuff. Um, but interestingly, like in high school, I was not a Tolkien person, even though the movies had come out and I really enjoyed them. I thought they were fun. I think the movies came out when I was in seventh grade. Um, but I was a C.S. Lewis person. I wanted to be an apologist when I was probably in eighth or ninth grade, which is probably a pretty weird thing. People tend to think that that's weird when I tell them that. So apparently it's not that usual. But that was my plan, was to be a professional apologist. I wanted to do what C.S. Lewis did. And so I was a Lewis guy for a long time. As I went through college, I started to develop my conviction that the best apologetics is really a good systematics, showing how everything connects together. And so that was what my PhD was actually in, was in systematic theology. And I've got a degree in church history and religious studies and philosophy. So I've kind of been all over the place, and that actually suited me very well to come back full circle and end up teaching apologetics, which is a sort of a Renaissance man department, right? You've got to know a little bit about everything, like Vitruvius says about the architect. You have to be very cognizant of a lot of different fields in order to see how they fit together, right? An apologist has to know how science works. Apologist has to know about biblical criticism. You've got to know history in order to rebut charges about, the Dark Ages, things like that. So I ended up just sort of doing the things that interested me, and lo and behold, I got a full-time job out of it, which is very, very privileged to have. So here at Houston Christian University, that's kind of what we do. The brand of apologetics that we do is called imaginative apologetics, and we are the best in the country at that. And I don't just say that because I chair the department. I would have said that before they hired me. We really do have a huge amount of top tier scholars that work in the department. I mean, you and I were just at a conference in Oregon, and half of the keynote speakers and about 10 to 15% of the audience had some affiliation, either faculty members or former students at Houston Christian University. And so
Mhm.
when I wrote this book, I actually had ended up setting myself up to be the perfect fit for that thing that I wanted to do when I was in eighth grade, which was be an apologist. So the Tolkien bug really sort of became terminal when I was in my PhD program, and I had finished up my master's degree at the University of Edinburgh, and I was doing some supplementary coursework to help the British degree convert more into an American degree. Um, and in the meantime, I did a paper on Tolkien and evil, and I noticed, hey, it's like, wow, this is Augustine, right? This is just the privatio boni, the deprivation of good. And so that sort of opened my eyes to the fact that there were people that are writing on Tolkien in an academic sense, and that there were journals on this, and it opened my eyes to all of the stuff that the finished, polished fantasy stories, but the side of Tolkien as an academic and as an intellectual. And so I ended up keeping on going with that, and everybody in my PhD program, including my supervisor at my dissertation defense, made jokes about how long is it going to take for Freeman to bring in Tolkien into the conversation. And so it was actually during my PhD program, I went to the Evangelical Theological Society annual meeting, which is going to be in a couple more weeks. I'll go back again. And I pitched this book, Tolkien Dogmatics, while I was still writing my dissertation, because I had seen a gap in the literature. And when you're an academic, you find a gap in the literature and it's something that you are passionate about, then you see that as a very great opportunity. I had read a lot of secondary literature about the Lord of the Rings. Is it Christian? Is it not Christian? What are the spiritual themes? All this stuff. But nobody had ever done what I wanted, which was, okay, well, Tolkien as a theologian, what is his doctrine? What does he believe? How does he fit these things together? And so Tolkien Dogmatics kind of started from the opposite pole of what all of the other books on Middle Earth had been. Like they start with the Lord of the Rings and they interpret the text in a spiritual direction. I actually started with Tolkien the man and tried to see how through his letters, through his academic lectures, through his other published writings, how he constructed his doctrine, and then went to Middle Earth to see whether he instantiated it that way. So here the fiction is the evidence rather than the primary source. I kind of flipped it a little bit, and it's organized as a systematic theology. So there's a chapter on God, creation, scripture, all the way down to eschatology. And each chapter can be read in a self-contained way. I heavily footnote it, and each of those chapters is pretty much the exhaustive treatment of what Tolkien has to say about each of those topics. So hopefully it's also a boon to future research for people that can continue to see Tolkien as a theologian. They can use that to jump off and then do their own research, including research that they feel like I got it wrong, right? Like go back and look through the footnotes and challenge me. I'm very eager for people to do that.
Which is always a fun exercise. I want to back up just a little bit to what you were saying about Houston Christian and the Imaginative Apologetics program, because I think I first became aware of that when I read Holly Ordway has one of her first books. I think it's called either Moral Apologetics or Imaginative Apologetics.
Yeah, Apologetics and the Christian Imagination.
That's the one. She was the first person that I ran into who was making, in a very serious way, the argument that Christians really ought to have access to the best stories, and that those stories were themselves the best channel for conveying gospel truth, and not in a simplistic kind of proselytizing, moralistic way, but because we have the true story. All good stories resonate with ultimate truth. And I'm sure there was probably some reference to Flannery O'Connor in there. She tends to come up in those kinds of things. Could you speak to just a moment to what is it about stories that really lends itself to bringing people into these kinds of conversations? I'm thinking of that line that Lewis has, where he talks about using story to kind of sneak past what he called the watchful dragons.
Watchful dragons, yeah.
Almost baptized kid who grew up in Sunday school and thinks, oh, I know all that stuff. But somehow a story can sneak past that. And then perhaps maybe where Tolkien fits in there, because Tolkien kind of famously said he was not trying to do allegory. He wasn't trying to do kind of this obvious thing. But you clearly found a lot of theological material in Tolkien. So where does story fit, and where does Tolkien fit in that use of story kind of as a channel for theology?
Yeah, well, I mean, just there's more than one kind of Christian fiction than allegory, right? Pilgrim's Progress is great, but it's not the only way of doing things. There's even more than one kind of allegory. Pilgrim's Progress is not the same thing as the Divine Comedy or the Fairy Queen, for instance. So when Aragorn, for instance, says, don't you know that the good and evil are the same thing among elves and dwarves and men, right? That's not an allegorical statement. That's just a statement about the objective nature of ethics. And why does Tolkien have Aragorn give that position? It's because it's Tolkien's position as a Roman Catholic, as a Christian. So there are ways of mining the text for these sorts of statements that Tolkien, as the narrator, would endorse. Of course, that's also the difficulty, is because these stories are fiction, it doesn't mean that there's this one-to-one correspondence with what Tolkien actually believes. We can't just look at this as a code that, okay, well, Tolkien has elves reincarnate and therefore Tolkien believes in reincarnation, for instance. No, he doesn't. Just as in the Bible, the fact that the Bible records that there are polygamists doesn't mean that the Bible tells you polygamy is a good thing. You have to look at what the narrator is trying to communicate through the shape of the story, and that requires literary criticism. It requires being a pretty intelligent reader of fiction. And Tolkien intends for us to do that. He doesn't pull punches with his audience. He expects you to follow along with him. But in terms of why the imagination, what's so important about that, metaphysically, it just seems to be the way that God has designed things to operate. If you look at God's revelation to human beings, you have the Word of God, Jesus Christ, who comes down and then participates in a history, right? He's got a narrative that is the narrative of his life, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has points of conflict. It has a climax. And this is also the way that God's written word is laid out. The majority of the Bible is not a didactic sort of thing, the way the letter to the Romans is. The majority of the Bible is chronicle. Some of it is even myth, if you want to define myth correctly, as not just something fictional. And so if this is the way that God has deemed best to communicate himself to human beings, then as Christians who are looking to communicate God to human beings, it would then make sense that we would follow along on the model that God has given us. There's even a particular passage that I like to point people towards and to illustrate the use of this in order to convince people of a particular truth. When you're an apologist or when you're evangelizing, the audience is generally going to be at least somewhat reticent to believe what you have to say. And so you're trying to get past the walls that they've put up when they're already assuming many times what you mean. They already think maybe they have a grasp of what Christianity is, and they're mistaken. As Holly argues in her book, sometimes they don't even know the content of the words that we're using, things like atonement or salvation. We have to illustrate what those things mean. And the best way of doing that is by giving examples. And that's what stories are, is just really thought out, fleshed out examples. In philosophy, you call them thought experiments even. It's the same thing. But the passage that I would direct people towards is the prophet Nathan confronting David about his sin with Bathsheba. So Nathan is prompted by God to go to David, and Nathan tells David the story about a rich man and a poor man. So the poor man has this one little lamb that eats from his table and it sleeps with him at night, and it's basically a part of the family. The rich man next door has plenty of flocks and plenty of herds, but he's got a guest and he doesn't want to kill any of his, and so he takes the poor man's little lamb and he kills it. And so Nathan asks David what should be done to this man, and David says this man should surely die because he had no pity. And then Nathan gives the famous line, "You are the man," right? That's you. This is when David realizes this was an allegory. This was David taking the one wife that Uriah had, and ultimately also murdering Uriah. Let's not forget that part. But David would have been very defensive if Nathan would have come in and just said, "Hey, you really screwed this up." And notice also that Nathan doesn't just give him a simile or a metaphor. He doesn't even just say, "Your action is as if a rich man stole a poor man's lamb." He actually gives quite a lot of extraneous detail in this passage, such as the fact that the lamb eats from the guy's table. All of this is stuff that makes it closer to reality for us, and it allows David to participate in that story imaginatively. That's what you're doing, is you're picturing yourself within that reference frame. And this is what softens David's heart toward accepting the truth. That's what imaginative apologetics is. It's a two-step process. So the first thing is you're using the faculty of the imagination in order to demonstrate to people that this is a world that is desirable to be true, right? This is the sort of world that I want to live in. This is even the content of the terms. I understand this and I see that to be good and desirable. And then you follow that up with a more traditional classical approach to apologetics, which is to say, not only is it desirable or beautiful, it is also true and good. So we don't just leave people in the realm of, well, isn't that a great story? We actually say, well, this is the real story. This is the true story, or the true myth, as Tolkien and Lewis would refer to it.
Love that. I appreciate you breaking that down for us into kind of a clear two-step process. Well, let's get into your book a little bit. Before we get to your book proper, I'll ask a question about the title. What exactly is a dogmatics? Because I think you told us what a systematic is along the way, but what's a dogmatics? Let's start there.
The title Tolkien Dogmatics is a riff on maybe the most famous theological work of the 20th century, Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics. And it's not just that, but the reason why Karl Barth called it the Church Dogmatics is because Barth was not apologizing for starting from explicitly Christian presuppositions. So there is a systematic theology, which is organized topically. There is pastoral theology, which is organized practically. There's polemical theology, what we might call ilinctics, which is supposed to be confronting people that have differing opinions on these subjects. Dogmatic theology is the sort of theology that starts from the assumption that Christianity is true and then proceeds to describe what is the case given that starting assumption. So you can talk about dogmatic theology in the sense of, okay, well, this is theology for Christians. And I think that's why I called it that, is these are the large-scale concepts through which Christianity operates. There's a large overlap with the discipline of systematics, but I wanted to press on that idea that Christians don't need to apologize for viewing the world or reading the world in a Christian way. And that's a large part of Tolkien's project as well. He believes in this thing called sacramental ontology. Now, he wouldn't have said that term. That term is invented later. But the idea is the whole world is disclosive of God and of the truths of Christianity when you approach it from the proper perspective. And so we can sort of sweep our arms in and gather everything in together under the banner of Christ and under the truth of the Word. So we don't have to apologize for what we believe, from the professor of apologetics. Short answer, it's riff on Karl Barth. Long answer, it's because it is explicitly Christian and does not feel the need to justify its starting assumptions.
Well, that's helpful, and particularly because I think there's a strange number of people who write about Tolkien and want to completely ignore his faith and his Catholicism. I did a little bit of digging into the Mythlore Journal a couple years ago, and I was astounded to run into people who think the orcs are Jews and are really Tolkien hating on Jews, and there's now like a queer approach to Tolkien studies. So you're actually doing something intentional by carving this out and saying, we're starting from the fact that Tolkien has this particular perspective and worldview, and we're not asking whether or not he did. We're starting from that foundation.
Yeah, it is surprising how many people sort of have that picket line, keep your God out of my Lord of the Rings. And I talk about this in the introduction to the book. There are people that have gone after me and that have gone after this book. That has been the standard charge, is Freeman assumes a lot about what Tolkien would have believed. Like, how do we know Tolkien wouldn't have been on board with transgenderism, for instance? Well, because he was a very conservative Roman Catholic that lived in 20th century Oxford. I think that's a fairly safe assumption based on the other parts of his theology that we know about. But for certain people, that's not enough. So I've had people write peer-reviewed journal articles critiquing my book, which, when that came out, I actually thanked them. I said, that's great. Not much scholarship nowadays gets direct interaction like that, especially so soon after it's come out. So I considered that to be a privilege, but you've got to argue the text. You say I'm starting from these presuppositions, but so are you, right? I've at least given you a page number where you can go back and check to see whether I'm interpreting Tolkien correctly or not. What's odd is that most of these people, the issue really is the problem of interpretation. Can we take Tolkien at face value, or can we not? And it seems odd that all of these people are perfectly fine with taking all of the passages that they agree with at face value, but not the passages that would challenge their particular non-Christian assumptions. Oh, well, Tolkien must have meant something else there. Or, oh, well, it's unclear. It's unclear what he meant or whether he would have taken that stance. I mean, there are things in Tolkien that I don't agree with theologically, but that's okay, right? I don't have to line up 100% with people that I enjoy or people that I'm in a conversation with. The problem, circling back to politics, is that there's a certain sort of worldview that has made everything into politics, and it's also developed into this binary us versus them. You're either on the side of the angels or you're the devil. And if there's any dispute there, it sort of colors the whole practice. And if it could be shown that Tolkien did not approve of homosexuality, for instance, then a lot of the people in these English departments would not feel that it would be ethical to study him. And so therefore they must explain in some sense how Tolkien either did not hold views critical of homosexuality, etc., or that it's unclear and open to alternative interpretations. And thus we have the Sam and Frodo romance.
Oh, that's disturbing on multiple levels. But I think it probably most significantly because the very existence of such scholarship prevents or makes it harder for folks who are actually looking for kind of academic reads on literature to get into the text itself and what is really happening on its own terms, because that's certainly not what Tolkien is doing. I don't know how you would ever get from just a straight. You've got to basically lost any sense of friendship to be able to read any sort of friendship as being sexual in its nature. And if you approach that do that with Tolkien, you've got to extend that same hermeneutic approach across all friendship and all literature. And at that point, there's no point in reading anyone. You're just making stories up and you're making up ideas in literature.
Well, there's some people that are willing to bite that bullet. I mean, that's ultimately where you end up. So the people that have critiqued me usually assume
hang on one second, Austin. I got to get my headphones just.
Uh-oh.
Let me try that again. Okay.
The glories of the live stream.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yeah, there are people that are willing to bite that bullet. I mean, most of these people are operating under a Foucauldian hermeneutic, right? All interpretation is power. There is no such thing as objective meaning, and therefore every time we read, we're constructing our own meaning. There is no meaning in the text itself. It's only constructed by the reader. And so whatever your interpretation is just as valid as anybody else's. That's the operating mindset that people approach these texts by, which then, of course, is self-defeating when you're trying to convince me to read things your way, namely in the Foucauldian way. I mean, I've challenged people that have critiqued the book online. Again, I'm not against critique. I invite scholarly critique. That's why you put something in public and why it goes through the peer review process. But you do need to demonstrate that you actually have said something wrong. Like I've given you the page numbers. I've given you my position. Prove to me or prove to somebody else the thing that I said, which is factually incorrect. But nobody has been able to do that, actually. They've only said, oh, Freeman imports too many presuppositions. So they're challenging it up here at the level of hermeneutics and not actually at the application level. Of course, the Tolkien Dogmatics is not a book of literary criticism. I say that explicitly in the prolegomena. I'm not trying to read Lord of the Rings in any particular way. I do think that there are meanings in text, and I think that the meaning is basically what the author intends to communicate, which is a controversial assumption nowadays. But I say in the book, I follow my PhD supervisor, Kevin Van Hooser, in my theological approach to interpretation. And if people are interested in justifying that approach, then they can go and read him. He's got a great book called Is There a Meaning in This Text? And he goes through and discusses all of this. But of course, nobody that has critiqued me has bothered to read or cite Kevin Van Hooser.
Well, I don't want to detour on Van Hooser, but if I'm tracking the discourse correctly, he just came out with a new book on Protestant hermeneutics that I don't know when I will have enough leisure time to just pick up a 600-page volume of hermeneutics that I don't need for any project I'm currently working on. But it's on my list of books that I'd love to read at some point. I have his Drama of the Doctrine of Scripture, or
Mhm.
Doctrine of the Drama, whatever the title is. And it was,
Drama of
I
Doctrine.
read, that's the one. I read the first couple chapters and was very hooked, and then life got busy. And
He's also
there we
got
go.
Remythologizing Theology, which you might also be interested in. But
Ooh.
he does write long books.
Well, there we go. Well, this whole the relationship between myth and theology and literature and scripture is a fascinating one. We might come back to that here at the end, but let's get into some of your theological categories. I wanted to see if we could start with the doctrine of creation, and particularly, what did you do anything with the I know Tolkien mostly in this sense, mostly through on fairy stories and his idea of subcreation. Is there walk us through what he thinks about the doctrine of creation, and particularly with any interest, any connection to subcreation?
Yeah. So this is one of the major distinctives in Tolkien's theology. If you're writing a systematic theology, you're not really looking for things that are completely new every time, right? Everybody's treading the same ground, but each of them is sort of looking at it from a slightly different angle. So there's a sense in which Tolkien isn't saying anything that Augustine or Aquinas or any of these other people haven't said, right? He believes in creation out of nothing. He believes that God is involved with the world, that miracles happen, that sort of thing. But each of us is also able to see things that other people aren't, right? C.S. Lewis says nobody should ever set out to try to be original. You should just try to tell the truth. Your originality will come automatically. So this is one of the particular ways in which Tolkien sees the world, is through the world as creation. And he means by creation not just God's act of calling the world into being, but also the doctrine of creation in the sense of what human beings are doing when they're participating in that activity. So for Tolkien, the doctrine of creation is also the doctrine of art. And so he sees the world as art, and he sees art also as imitating God's action towards the world. It is a bi-directional relationship. But Tolkien believes that God is an order of being higher than humans, and therefore human beings don't call things into existence out of nothing. They have to operate on pre-existing materials. And so Tolkien calls it subcreation rather than creation, in order to distinguish it from God's absolute creation, right? No human being can invent a new color. No human being can invent a brand new animal. You're only using pre-existing parts and things that has already been put out for you in the world by God, who has actually genuinely created. And so Tolkien sees art and beauty as a primary avenue through which God is disclosing himself to us. So he sees our participation in making as a way in which we actually fulfill the image of God, that God is a maker, and therefore we are these sub-creators. We too are calling things into being. And that's one reason why he sees the imagination is so important, because he says fantasy is almost that closest thing to what it is like when God makes the world in the first place. This is a huge emphasis for him. He drives this a lot from the romanticism that precedes him. Tolkien is a romantic thinker, not in the sense of a Byron or a Shelley, more in the sense of a Wordsworth or a John Ruskin or a George MacDonald. But he ties the aesthetic dimension of life a lot more directly towards our experience of God than many other people do that tend to emphasize the rational alone. But creation is one of his primary contributions as a theological thinker, because he's thinking so much about art and about writing. One of his primary metaphors for God is the author of the text, or the author of the great story. And so if you're looking to say, okay, well, what can I, as a systematic theologian, actually take from this British fantasy writer and literature professor that's actually going to help me in my constructive task for the church? This is one of those areas that you would look. Creation is going to be one of those that Tolkien actually does have a lot to say, that if you're just a theologian, you might have missed.
Well, it's definitely one of the places that I remember being very encouraged. He was the first person I ever read who I felt like took fantasy seriously, and he was the first one to say, actually, no, this actually is a really primary human activity to want to create, and the human desire to not just tell a real story grounded in the real world, but actually to create a whole world around your story is actually you looking a bit like God. not in that satanic way, but in the actual human way in which we are intended to image God. And I love the way he expresses this in the poem Mythopoeia, where just and the idea that even the story, the myth has to pre-exist the actual manifestation of the thing. It's like God's creative act has to come before our human creative act, and any human acts, anything we create happens to fit inside of this ultimate creative act that God is doing. I just think it's a beautiful way to articulate the human desire to be creative.
Yeah. And there are levels to that as well. I mean, if you read the opening chapter of the Silmarillion, which is Tolkien's creation myth, speaking about the doctrine of creation, you see that God has authored other authors, right? He has made makers beneath himself. And so, for instance, when Melkor, who is Satan, whatever he's trying to author, whatever he's trying to make, these wicked, twisted things, it never actually escapes that primary creative action that God has intended. It's always working towards the fulfillment of that story that's up here on this higher level. And that includes our creative actions as well. We are all, it's stories within stories. There is one primary author that's writing all of it.
Ah, beautiful. We got a comment in that I'm going to put on the screen for a second. So a buddy of mine from college, Matt Noble, said, "This is a fascinating and invigoratingly old-fashioned conversation about Tolkien's worldview. I have just added the book to my Christmas wish list." So thank you both. Well, thanks, Matt, and glad to know that he's enjoying that. We've had a bunch of people popping in and out on the live stream. So if anybody does want to leave us a comment or ask a question, I'll find a way to work those in, or we'll kind of hit a bunch of them at the end of our conversation. Well, Austin, what can you tell us about angels? I'm quite curious. I saw you had a whole chapter about Tolkien and angels. What does Tolkien think about angels?
Yeah, I actually have double the standard number of chapters on this subject that most people have, because I also have a chapter on Satan and demons.
Wow,
part of that is dictated by just how much Tolkien talks about them, right? So there are the proportion of the length of the chapters is constituted by the amount of material in Tolkien that I have to cover and describe and summarize. And so I planned on just having a chapter on sin and evil, but I found that Tolkien was talking so much about the devil and the demonic that it needed its own chapter. This is partially due to his traditional, or, as Matt said, old-fashioned mindset that in systematics prior to the 19th, 17th century, angelology was a standard locus of theological reasoning. There is, in fact, already a Christian doctrine of other non-human intelligent life. Christianity has already had that concept since the very beginning and all the way back into the Old Testament. And so it's something that's worth thinking about. There are other creatures than human beings that relate to God, and some of them have fallen and some of them are actually interfering with us now. So both angels and demons affect our lives, and Tolkien, rooted as he is in classical literature and in medieval literature, is well aware of that. He exists mentally prior to the embarrassment that comes into that doctrine as the mechanistic worldview starts rising in the 1700s. So Tolkien, again, is a major contributor, I think, in the modern theological conversation about what exactly the function of angels are in our 2024 life. How could we not be embarrassed to believe in angels? I find it interesting, actually. Surveys show that 2/3 of Americans and Canadians, like two-thirds of people, believe that angels exist. And yet, why does it seem like it's so ridiculous to talk about? The majority of people agree with you. So why don't you have any role to give them? And I think it's because we know that they exist, but we don't know what it would be like for them to exist, right? As Holly says, we don't have a lot of a content for that term anymore. Tolkien gives us that. So Tolkien, in his search to create a Christian way of giving us a pantheon of different gods, whether they be like Thor and Odin, or Zeus and Ares and all these other people, he says, I was looking for a way of having the gods for a mind that believed in the Blessed Trinity. And so all he does is he takes the pantheon of gods and he bumps them down from gods into angels. And so you have God, the one, Eru over all. He is a distinct kind of being that is above them, but he has his other supernatural agents who are operative in the world, and they're governing the way that the world unfolds in both large and small ways. And you've got some that rebel, and that's Melkor and the Balrogs and all of his other Umayar, as the elvish term is. And in fact, Tolkien doesn't intend this, although I'm sure he's aware of it. This is more biblical than most of our modern conceptions of what angels are like, because you have this idea in the Old Testament called the divine council. In Hebrew, it's the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. And there are angelic beings which are instituted by God to oversee the governance of creation. We see this all over Scripture. Most people nowadays are going to access this concept through somebody like Michael Heiser, The Unseen Realm, or any of his work. But this is a ancient concept. It's got a venerable pedigree, and it is something that Tolkien is giving us directly in a modern take. Right, he is a modern that's writing something that is accessing and retrieving this older concept of the divine council. So the angels actually do have things to do, but they're not centered. Right, the gods are the center of these Greek myths in a lot of ways, but they're not in Tolkien. It's the mortals that are the purpose of creation. The gods are there to be the stewards and the servants of this greater plan of the redemption of mortals. And so Tolkien is able to give us these supernatural non-human figures that possess great dignity and great power, but without taking away the importance of human agency, without slipping into magical thinking or superstition. He's able to show us what the term angel would have meant to the biblical authors and to the church fathers and to many other people. And I think that's really important.
Well, that is, I think that's really interesting, because the only other place that I've encountered detailed thinking about angels, I did 5 years at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and we did not talk really about angelology in any meaningful way. But I did take an ancient Christianity course at Hillsdale College, and Professor Siegel had us read Pseudo-Dionysus and his description of the 9 choirs of angels. And Professor Siegel wanted us to be clear that I was one of several very evangelical students at Hillsdale. And so he wanted to be really clear that, like, this Catholic author is not just making it up and ignoring the Bible. Like, he walked us through several biblical references for these different types of angels. And we spent time in Isaiah, in Ezekiel, and in the book of Daniel, kind of tracing these and kind of thinking through what exactly would it mean if we took this seriously, that there is in fact an angel who wrestled with the prince of Tyre and was like delayed getting to the prophet Daniel for 3 days because there was a literal spiritual struggle that prevented the angel from getting there. And the palpable nature of the spiritual reality in the Old Testament mind, and certainly in the mind of late antiquity, I find myself torn, because I simultaneously want to say, well, it's in Scripture. I have no reason to say it's not there, but I have this innate skepticism to say, no, I just don't walk around in my actual day-to-day life thinking, an angel probably just saved my life, because otherwise I would have wrecked my car today. I don't do that. And so was your sense that Tolkien like really did believe that angels, and I suppose their counterparts, the demons, are those active forces in the real world?
Yes, very much so. He's got a letter where he speaks about he has a mystical vision in the church at a particular point in his life, where he sees a beam of light that's coming through the church windows, and he says that he's struck that this is, he calls it a vision, that this beam of light is the attention of God that's manifested on all of these little motes that are flickering through the church, right? These little dust motes, I presume. And he talks about how the mote is me, and the sun is God, and the line or the ray of light from the sun to the mote is God's attention personalized, and that is an angel. So he is very cognizant of the fact that angels are real and that they are active in the world. I mean, especially as a Roman Catholic, he has access to this whole tradition of St. Michael, the feast of St. Michael and all angels, right? That even in Oxford and Cambridge, their academic calendar is organized around this, right? Michaelmas is one of the names of the terms in Oxford, and it's the Michael Mass. It's the Mass about St. Michael the Archangel. So he would have been very comfortable talking about how they were involved in human life and in human affairs. He says Hitler has a demonic energy, for instance. That there's a lot of stuff that he talks about in the letters, right, in his nonfiction, where he is ascribing activities to angels. So this is not something that he's just leaving aside for the fantasy sci-fi readers. This is something he thinks is going on in our real life.
It's so interesting that, I mean, I know there's been plenty of attention paid to Lewis's Screwtape letters as kind of articulating the demonic mentality. But I think it'd be honestly quite interesting to pull together everything that both Lewis and Tolkien said about the spiritual life and spiritual entities and see what they had in common and where those distinctions were. I don't know what that would turn into, but I think it'd be very interesting.
I mean, I do it a little bit in the book. At the end of my chapter on angels, I bring in some of the stuff from Screwtape letters, where at the end, the patient in Screwtape is dying, and Screwtape is envisioning the angels coming to receive him and to take his soul to heaven, which is a patristic image of one of the well, actually, it's an image from Jesus. Jesus says the angels are the reapers. They're the ones that gather in the harvest and take them into the barn. So he's got this image that I use to talk about how we might conceive of what Lewis says, oh, well, so it was you all along, right? These things in our life that we kind of have in the background that we would notice only if it weren't there. It's become such a regular aspect of our life. But of course, Screwtape Letters is very famously dedicated to J.R.R. Tolkien, and he hated that because he didn't think that it was healthy for Lewis to have spent so much time trying to imitate the mind of a demon. And of course, Lewis ultimately came to that same conclusion. He said that was the most unpleasant book that he ever wrote.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit, because I am really curious about Tolkien's eschatology. Does he fit in any of our kind of standard contemporary categories of premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial, preterist, anything in that, or is he doing something very different with eschatology?
He doesn't talk a ton about it. He talks a lot about death, but he's talking about individual death. So death is a category under eschatology. But even in Middle Earth, he doesn't have a ton to say. There is a passage that doesn't make it into the final Silmarillion, which is a sort of the Ragnarok of Middle Earth. And it's fairly available online. People can go in and read it. But it does owe a lot more to Ragnarok than it does to Revelation in a lot of ways. He affirms the traditional things, like there is a heaven where you're conscious and where you live forever with God. It's the place of the blessed. He believes that hell exists. He believes that it's painful, believes that you don't get out of it. He believes in purgatory, right? He's got a whole story called Leaf by Niggle where he outlines what his image of, or at least imaginative image of what purgatory might be like is. But in general, when we talk about eschatology for Tolkien, we are talking about his idea of death. And this is something that develops over time for him. He begins as a young man in the 19-teens, as he's writing the first drafts of the Silmarillion. He calls death the gift of men. This is something that Iluvatar has given to men rather than elves, because it is a way for them to escape the world of sin and move into eternity. And that, so far as it goes, is orthodox, right? We do die and then move into eternity. We don't want to be trapped forever within the fallen world, but we're waiting for God to redeem the physical world. So this is not quite Platonism or Neoplatonism where we're just trying to escape the body. But there was a time in which Tolkien did believe that natural death was not a result of the fall. It was just the way that God designed things to operate. Now, as he progresses in his life, you see him shifting away from that position and towards what we would consider to be a more orthodox tradition of death is the final enemy. And you can trace it in his drafts. You can trace this idea of how he's going to shift the concept of death as a gift, something which is a good thing that humans do, into the coherence with this idea that death is the great evil. And so he ends up with the idea that, well, the Silmarillion is written by elves, and all of human stories are ultimately stories about death, or stories about trying to escape from death. If you had an elvish story, if it were possible, it would probably be about the escape from deathlessness. And so the perspective of the Silmarillion is not necessarily the perspective of Tolkien, the author, he says. It is the perspective of the elvish authors, these quasi-unreliable narrators, we could say, about what humans ought to take death to be. That death is a gift. It is, if it is received in faith in God, it is the doorway into eternal life, which ultimately is what Paul says, right? "Oh, death, where is your victory? Oh, death, where is your sting?" So that's ultimately where he ends up. But in that chapter, I talk about the fact that he is consciously then conforming his fiction to what he develops his theological convictions to be. And he does that several times, actually.
That is quite interesting, because I did not expect that to go specifically from eschatology to death, but then even to be able to see the transition of Tolkien's thought in his own stories. So it's always kind of interesting to see kind of the and it's sometimes really easy to imagine authors that we love as kind of always being the final people that they become as they've written these transcendent works. But they, of course, are themselves subject to life and maturity, and their own ideas develop. As you were describing, I just want to briefly mention, I love Leaf by Niggle. That is one of my contenders for my favorite writing by Tolkien. I don't know if it's Leaf by Niggle or Mythopoeia or the Silmarillion. Depending on the day, I might say one of the three. I've always thought of every time I've read that one, I get to there's that initial frustration that Niggle has. He just can't get these leaves to come out correctly. And then there's when he's in purgatory or in eternity, and he finally sees like what these leaves have always been becoming. And I have this kind of, I've always thought like this has got to be some representation of how Tolkien felt about his own work. I mean, I think it's one of the most interesting differences between Lewis and Tolkien, where Lewis sort of had this ability to like dash off a novel. Like he talks about sort of just like writing Narnia, and he came out with these books so quickly. Like World War II years were so fruitful for him. And Tolkien's over there just slaving away at draft after draft after draft after draft. And so that I have that in mind as I read Leaf by Niggle. And it always strikes me as just at least an encouragement that someday those of us who are trying to like say something, however limited it might be in this world, someday we'll get to eternity and see what God did with our piddling little efforts to say something.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And he calls this out explicitly. So I've got a book that's coming out this next year with Walking Tree Press called Tolkien Among the Theologians, and Claudio Testi is an Italian scholar, very well regarded for his work on Tolkien and Thomas, has a chapter on Leaf by Niggle where he demonstrates pretty conclusively that this is what Tolkien kind of wanted or prayed would happen, is that when he gets to heaven, his creation would be something that he could actually enter into, and he could see it the way that it was meant to be. And that's also how he ends on fairy stories, is that fantasy is the effoliation and enrichment of creation. That this is something that God allows in his mercy for us to see. He takes it up and perfects it. That would make perfect sense. If you take part of the image of God to be a sub-creator, then part of the glorification of that image would be to see that creation the way that it is intended without sin.
Oh, the beautiful thought. One other follow-up question on there, and then we gotta shift over to a different question. Do you know, is there any connection between Tolkien and Kierkegaard?
No, not that I know of. I mean, I'm sure you read him at some point, just because people in Oxford in those days actually had an education. But he doesn't quote him in any sense.
Okay.
If there's any connection, it would be downstream of or upstream of both of them, some sort of common source that they both are sharing.
I just, as you were describing that, I hadn't heard that idea of the kind of an elvish author for the Silmarillion. It reminded me of Kierkegaard's habit of inventing fictitious authors for his own books, just to further distance the argument, so that and there's endless speculation in Kierkegaard scholarship about what did Kierkegaard actually think? And I just wonder if there's any sense of that kind of motivation in Tolkien's mind. I just wanted to kind of separate the Silmarillion a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, he uses this conceit of a pseudo authorship. He's picking it up really from people like Rider Haggard and other folks that are
Okay.
creating these pseudo historical apparatuses that give this verisimilitude to their work. And Holly actually in her book Tolkien's Modern Reading talks about that. But in terms of the unreliable narrator, it's a blessing that Tolkien is generally pretty clear about where he departs and agrees with his narrative personae. So like he tells us in one of his letters, for instance, one of the primary differences between his myth and the Christian myth, and by this he just means the cosmological story, is that in Middle-earth, of course, the fall happens prior to the actual creation, prior to the let it be, in the music stage, whereas in Christian theology, the fall happens after God has created the world. So he generally will flag for us the ways that he departs from or corresponds to what he really thinks. And the letters is just such a goldmine of Tolkien being sort of unguarded, especially now that the revised and expanded edition of the letters has come out. There's so much more about his personal mentality. I mean, part of it is this is the problem of interpretation. You do have to sort of make an argument or make a judgment call as to how much you think Tolkien, the author, means this and how much this is just part of the narrative device. Mileage may vary depending on the reader, but in general, it's not that hard if you have a good understanding of what theology would be, to know, okay, well, that's weird. He probably doesn't really think that. That's probably just for fun.
Oh, I think that's fair. But let me ask you about one other chapter. I was very intrigued to see you have a chapter on the Christian life, in part because obviously, at least for the Silmarillion and the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, Jesus is not present directly. He's not establishing a church. There is no kind of grand Middle Earth religion or codification of theological text or anything like that. So what does Tolkien say about the Christian life in his broader writings? And then does any of that show up in kind of Tolkien's myth that he's created?
Yeah, he does have quite a lot to say about the Christian life. And I mean, I make a distinction in the book between his ecclesiology, his doctrine of the church and the sacraments, and then the Christian life. That's where I categorize it mostly as, friendship, sanctification, virtue and vice, the role of the Christian in the government systems, those sorts of things. But he does have quite a lot to say about that because, of course, most of his letters, or a lot of his letters, are to his family and friends. And he is not hesitant to have those conversations with people in writing. Wonderful letters to his sons, giving them advice as a father, as a Christian father. So he does have a lot to say there. When we move to Middle Earth, it becomes a much more large-scale project to try to mine those themes. So, for instance, what does Tolkien think about friendship? Okay, well, I'm going to need a lot more pages to digest that because that's like the whole of the Lord of the Rings, right? That requires that's a much more narrative answer than it is like a propositional answer. You have to explore how Tolkien illustrates this in the story itself, than to sort of pull quotes out and say, "Oh, look there, Tolkien referenced purgatory." So it becomes harder because it is so much more baked into the shape of what he's doing with his fiction. But these sorts of pursuit of virtue and the everyday life of prayer, for instance, there are indications in the book that he finds these to be obviously massive importance. We're talking about prayer, for instance. There are some things where even though Middle Earth is in a pre-Christian realm, he still illustrates the function that prayer would take. Faramir, for instance, is a good Númenorian, and he always has his silent prayer to God before they eat their dinner. And he seems a little puzzled that the hobbits don't. it is interesting in the larger perspective of like living as Christians in the world. There is no church, as you say, in Middle Earth. There was one on the island of Numenor. There was an outdoor temple where the king was also the only priest, and at various points in the Numenorian calendar, they would go up there and have festivals where they would worship Eru and commune with the Valar. But at the destruction of Numenor, there is no more priest, and there is no more visible temple. Of course, the only famous temples in Middle Earth are temples to the devil. So the giant temple of Numenor, which included human sacrifice, these other dark pagan shrines, like at the Dead Men of Dunharrow and the Paths of the Dead, these things. So yeah, there is a visible religious structure, but it's never a good one, which I find pretty interesting for a Roman Catholic to be writing about. There are no depictions of God, and there are no ritual or institutional religious structures. If I were Tolkien, I would say, well, that's because God hasn't revealed them yet, right? So this happens somewhere between Genesis 1 and Genesis 11, right? This is in the world of natural theology, prior to the call of Abraham, prior to God calling out the nation of Israel. And so if you're a Presbyterian, you could say, well, Tolkien just has a regulative principle of worship, right? The pagans don't know the way that God wants them to approach him, and so they sort of keep their distance. So they have this faith that God exists, but they're not going to presume how to relate to him until he tells them.
Well, I'll see you one excellent answer, and I'll raise you a really bad idea that there are plenty of people that want to have written about like wishing they could somehow make Lewis be either Orthodox or almost Catholic. And they're like, oh, if he had just lived a little longer, he would have gone one of those directions. Maybe somebody could take the argument you just made and turn that into like, well, actually, Tolkien was actually a secret Protestant.
Well, now you mentioned that, Josh. My chapter in Tolkien Among the Theologians is on Tolkien and Calvin. I don't claim that Tolkien is a secret Calvinist, but I do say that there are 5 points at which he and Calvin are pretty close to each other, surprisingly. No, with Lewis, I don't think it's if he would have lived longer, he would have become Catholic. I think if he would have been born somewhere else, he might have become Catholic, but he was from Ulster.
That at least has been most of my response when people raise that. I'm like, I'm pretty sure at that point he was from Ulster and had lived in England a long time, and that seemed to be more significant to him than identifying with a particular confession. Austin, let me ask you, I've got a couple of questions as we wrap up today. I want to ask you the favorites question. What is your favorite Tolkien book, story, or poem, if you had to pick one?
I actually do think Leaf by Niggle is probably my favorite at this point. I just find it very meaningful and emotionally moving to me. I always think that we as modern Christians tend not to dwell on heaven enough. And I find that that's a really good way of getting me in the proper headspace to think about the eternal weight of glory that's waiting for us. It's interesting that Leaf by Niggle is composed in such a different way than most of, or pretty much all of Tolkien's other stories. He says he just woke up and it was in his head and he wrote it down pretty much in the first draft. That's how it stayed. And again, if you know anything about Tolkien's compositional process, that's pretty weird. So in one of my chapters, I talk about how Tolkien did believe that he was guided and inspired, not in a canonical sense, but in the sense that God and the Holy Spirit directs his creative processes. And sometimes he believes that happens fairly directly. So Tolkien probably assumes that Leaf by Niggle is some sort of clearer, more direct thing that God has gifted him rather than him coming up with on his own. So it's also one of those that you can read in a sitting, right? This is something that if you want to get a picture for who Tolkien is, both as a Christian and a writer, but you want to see it divested from the Lord of the Rings that a lot of people have kind of become so familiar with, that's a great one to hand to people as well.
Well, and he's certainly not alone in that experience. And I think every time I read, I've read Hesiod's Theogony probably 5 or 6 times for different classes I've taught over the years, and Each time we hit this passage about the muses, and there are so many authors who have this sense of, and the muses become that picture of divine inspiration with something less than Holy Writ. Of like the sense of I'm a vessel for this idea, not so much like I am the origin of this idea.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't shock me at all if Tolkien had that experience. Austin, why do you think Tolkien continues to resonate? You mentioned earlier, if I remember correctly, we're roughly the same age. I remember those movies, the movies coming out, middle school, high school, and Tolkien being very popular. And I got into reading Tolkien because that was the thing that homeschool kids who read a lot, like they kind of measured their coolness by the ability to like write fragments in Kenya or be able to like drop arcane knowledge from Tolkien. So I got into Tolkien largely just because I wanted to be able to have those conversations. But then we're close to 20 years later, and Amazon's now out with Rings of Power. What is it about Tolkien, his writings and his world that continue to resonate?
Well, in tying in with our discussion in the previous question, Tolkien tells a writer that has penned a letter to him. He says, anything of sanctity that you find, it comes not from me, but through me. So I think that's what a lot of people are sensing, is they sense the aura of sanctity in Tolkien's world. It is a world that makes goodness attractive. As C.S. Lewis says when he reads George MacDonald's Fantastes, it baptizes his imagination. There's this bright shadow. He understands that this is what holiness feels like eventually. And this is something that's very alien to most people. We know, as a result of the failure of the materialist experiment, we know that there is some sort of supernatural or numinous quality to existence, but we're desperately trying to figure out what it is. That's why we're repaganizing as a culture, is we're looking for whatever that thing was. And a lot of people that are disconnected from the church are finding it in places like The Lord of the Rings. Now, what the pity is that they don't know where Tolkien is getting it from. So that's why I'm very hesitant to just outright bash the Rings of Power. And by the way, I do think season 2 was a pretty substantial improvement over season 1. But there are so many people that are looking for God at the bottom of a bottle. There are so many people that are looking for God in bad fantasy novels. But they're all looking for this experience. As Augustine says, nobody loves anything other than God if we understood what we love properly. And so they're drawn to it because they are drawn to the truth and the beauty of who God is. And I would hope that it's our job as the church to be able to show people that what they actually love is God in Christ. And that brings us right back to the very beginning, right? That's the task of imaginative apologetics. Half of your work is already done. People want it to be true. You just have to break down those final barriers and say, well, actually, this is the Middle Earth is the real world, right? This is the way that things operate here. This is the sort of God that exists. These are the sort of beings that are involved in your life. There is a meaning to your suffering, right? There is light and high beauty forever beyond our reach, right? That's real.
It's a beautiful, beautiful answer. I do, as a side note, agree with you on Rings of Power. I was very disappointed with season 1. I wanted season 1 to give me a lot more positives about Numenor. I've been told by a couple of folks that there were quite a few constraints that the show was working with in terms of like what parts of the story they could access. But then season 2, once I was so happy that we kind of got away from angry feminista Galadriel and got she's still a warrior, but I saw Galadriel in season 2. I had a lot of trouble perceiving her as Galadriel in season 1.
Yeah, I mean, she has her arc, right? She's a dynamic character. You have to see her grow and develop. The issue is that she grows and develops over centuries, and we only have 8-10 episodes. So that's the problem of the compression of this timeline. Yeah, they only have the rights to the appendices. They can't do anything from the Silmarillion legally. So they have to figure out ways of telling the same story only from the material in the appendices, but without violating the Silmarillion.
Oh, that's quite the artistic challenge. We do have one other question that came in, once again, from Matt Noble. He put a comment that I'm afraid is too big for me to show all of, but I'm going to read his comment, and let's see what we can make of it. If possible, would you speak to Tolkien's unique narrative style and how that might reflect aspects of theology or worldview? Tolkien seems to spend most of his time in a limited omniscience perspective, but then semi-frequently dips into deep past and even future events without regard to how it influences the reader. Does this in any way reflect a mimicking of how Scripture is written, with thinking about authors who reference the earliest moments of human history, but also have divine revelation about end times? Dr. Freeman, what are your thoughts? I'll leave that up for a minute, just so anybody reading later on will be able to see it. But what are your thoughts on that question?
I don't think he's necessarily deliberately referencing Scripture in terms of authorial perspective. In terms of narrative style in general, you can see quite a bit of Old Testament in the Silmarillion. I do think that probably is more deliberate because it's a model of elevated style, but it's by no means his only influence. He has plenty of other classical and ancient literature that has the same sort of style that he could adopt. But in general, this idea of, okay, third person, second person, omniscient, limited, unreliable narrator, all of these are modern categories. And so when Tolkien is naturally writing stories that he enjoys, he's just going to slip into the writers that he knows that don't really care as much about those things. I mean, there are people like Herodotus or Thucydides that are conscious of, I'm going to write the reports that I got. But in general, especially in medieval authors, they'll just go all over the place. They'll go where they feel like it. And so that's probably what Tolkien does. But we do have to remember that at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, he gives us this whole pseudo-history of how this manuscript got here and how he translated it and how it was compiled, right? So you've got Frodo, who's writing most of it, and then Sam fills in the end, and then Pippin goes into Gondor and he fills in some stuff from the archives in Gondor, and it all sort of gets fit together. There's these multiple editorial recensions that end up with the manuscript history of the Red Book of Westmarch. So that's another reason why he could just say, oh, well, that's, that was a part that Pippin edited. He's got that in his in-universe explanation as well. And Lewis kind of played along with this, right? One of their earliest things when they were just sort of getting to know each other, Tolkien shared very vulnerably some drafts of his poetry from, I think it was Baron and Luthien. And C.S. Lewis, knowing that this was something that Tolkien had been very vulnerable to share with him, rather than just saying, these lines suck, he went through and created this pseudo-scholarly approach to say, well, we can identify at least 3 different authors to this manuscript history. And he goes through and he gives like a textual critical analysis of this poem that Tolkien handed him. So it's a game that they both played with each other. And that probably has something to do with it as well, is that in general, it's a style that Tolkien is adopting from his pre-modern sources. And secondarily, he will allow himself in universe to do that because he does believe that there's a fake textual history that's attached to all of these. Right? The elves have a lot of privileged information, for instance, because they have spoken like bodily with the angels that were there. Right? The elves know what the creation of the universe is like because Manwë told them when they were in Valinor or when they were in Aman, like they were given these stories from firsthand accounts. In fact, this becomes a problem later on as Tolkien sort of spins this out. If Middle-earth is the real world, just in this mythical past, well, the elves, being educated directly by the angels, would have known that the earth was never flat, right? It should have always been a globe. Okay, so then what do we do with all of these myths about the flat earth and the rounding of the world in the Second Age? And so now he creates these problems for himself because the elves have access to this knowledge that the men of the Twilight don't have. And then you've got the Numenorians, who are this mediating force. So they're receiving this privileged information from the elves via the angels, but then they're also like corrupted. And it's a telephone game. They have their own perspective that they're adding this human mortal layer on here, and it becomes very complex. And I think that also has to be said.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. The only thing I want to add to that, not in any way disagreeing, is that I find it really helpful to resist a temptation to read either Lewis or Tolkien. And in my writing, at least, is far more Lewis-centered than it is Tolkien. But there's a temptation, I think, to like read Lewis as this sort of medievalist with a spreadsheet and think that he is sort of like picking each block that he's going to like then drop into a Chronicle of Narnia, for example. And that just really, I don't think is terribly a helpful way to think about him. Instead, I think of both him and Tolkien as 2 men who are so learned, they are so deeply read, that when they sit down to like write stories, this is all sort of bubbling up and just emerging. And then they're trying to take their deep literary training and shape the thing that emerged.
Yes.
And so there's this constant like back and forth and dialectical tension between like, well, the story just needs to be this. And then there's like, but it also really ought to have an inclusio here. And so like it's just not quite as intentional as sometimes I think. And Matt, I don't mean to say that your question is necessarily trying to imply motive or intent, but I think there's a temptation for us looking back on them to imply a lot more like construction than is really warranted. Would you agree with that, Austin?
I would, yeah. I think the primary thing is something unconscious or automatic. I mean, Tolkien calls it the leaf mold of the mind, right? Like he says, I don't know what influenced what. I mean, there are some things I can identify, but generally, like everything is just coming into me and it's percolating, and it's blending into this new substance that then comes out as an organic whole when I'm writing. You know, they said of John Bunyan, "You prick him and he bleeds scripture." Right? That's the idea, is that it's become so saturated into these people that this is just how they think now. And so that leaf mold of the mind, or that sort of unconscious molding of these sources into just this tertium quid, comes out, and then in their editing process, their compositional process, they do devote conscious attention to restructuring and editing. I think that's exactly right, in my opinion.
Well, Austin, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been really fun. We've now spent almost an hour and a half not thinking consciously about who's going to be the next president of the United States, which today at least is a very refreshing way to spend some time.
Now we'll desperately go back on Twitter and make ourselves anxious again. Yeah.
That's right. Well, just in case people have heard you and they want to know about what books you have coming out, what articles you have coming out, where can they find and follow your work online?
Yeah, so you can look me up at Houston Christian University. It's hc.edu. But my Twitter handle is just Dr. Austin Freeman. Most of what I do on Twitter is post books that I have read. And so you can sort of follow along with what I'm doing. But any interviews like this, I'll post on there if you see me elsewhere. And that's probably the best place. Of course, you could also come and take some classes with me. We also often have surveyor classes or auditor classes that are available here at Houston Christian University. And then, of course, our Master of Arts in Apologetics is fully online. So people can actually enroll and get a master's degree in this and study with me and with Holly Ordway and with Michael Ward of Planet Narnia and with Mike Lacona and Dave and all these other people that are top-tier apologists that are doing this sort of thing. And you'd be most welcome.
I think I started my graduate work at Faulkner University in the fall of 2017, and I discovered there was something of a pipeline between Houston Christian University for master's work, and then at least at the time, I think it's still there, but there were always at least 3 or 4 people who'd done their work at then HBU, then now Houston Christian University, and had come on to Faulkner, and there's a pretty regular group of people from Faulkner who write for a thing called an Unexpected Journal that was founded out of Houston Christian University's apologetics program, and you guys are doing great work. I'm very excited that you're producing such well-trained people who are thinking very clearly about the arts and about Christianity and their intersection.
Yep. Now I'll give one more plug. March 22nd. Is our annual Apologetics Day event, and it will be the theme of Tolkien and imaginative apologetics, this thing specifically. And so we'll have Holly give one of the keynotes, and then we've got Trevor Hart from the University of St. Andrews, who will be one of our other keynotes. We'll have some breakout sessions. So if anybody is in the Houston area or wants to come to the Houston area, we're also about to release a call for papers. If anybody has a paper that they want to present on this topic the Friday before that, on March 21st, then you can submit that and then come and hang out with us and keep talking about it.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that's your plug is well timed, because I'll make sure to put this early in season 8 when we drop this. So we'll get that plug out for folks who make it to the end. Now, I think you mentioned this already, but I do want to ask you as well. Remind us real quick about your forthcoming book. You said Tolkien Among the Theologians. Yeah.
So Tolkien Among the Theologians is coming out hopefully in 2025. With Walking Tree Press. Like it's with the publisher now. We're picking out covers, so it's coming pretty soon. And that's a result of our symposium that we had a few years ago here at HCU. Some really top tier people, right? Like Giuseppe Pizzini, University of Oxford. Holly's got a chapter. I've got my chapter on Tolkien and Calvin. Craig Boyd, St. Louis University. Like a lot of people, Lisa Kutras, Tolkien's Theology of Beauty. Like a lot of people that are top tier Tolkien scholars ended up at this conference and with chapters in this volume. And then I've got another one. I've got another one coming out that we talked about in George Fox University, and I'm shifting to C.S. Lewis within the next few years, and writing on C.S. Lewis and the classics and the classical influence on Narnia. So that's a far future project, but that's coming up too.
Well, that's very exciting. Well, whenever that project is maybe a little closer to completion, we'll have to get you back on the show to talk about that. That would be really fun. Maybe we can arrange some sort of symposium with Lewis people and Lewis and the classics. Austin, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been really fun.
Yeah, thanks, Josh.
Thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us today here on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest has been Dr. Austin Freeman of Houston Christian University, and the book that you need to order is Tolkien Dogmatics, Theology through Mythology in Middle-earth. Until next time,
and
love the good.
Theology, Fantasy, and the Imagination, featuring Josh Herring.
Well, that's true. I managed to get all the way through without plugging the book that I do have a chapter in. I'll also go ahead and confess, this was my horrible error. I did not put together the Austin Freeman who emailed me about 100 times over this book project with the Austin Freeman that I met there at the Undiscovered Lewis Conference. But Austin edited this wonderful book, Theology, Fantasy, and the Imagination. I do have a chapter in that one. It's a great book, and it's another great collection of thoughts on the intersection of all of these ideas we've been talking about today. And with that, dear readers, now that we have supplied you, dear listeners and watchers, and hopefully future dear readers, we've supplied you with your Christmas book list and a lot of other things that you can also order in the spring. Until next time, love the good, seek the true, and enjoy the beautiful.
You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, please do find and follow us on X and on YouTube. On X, you can find me as @TheOptimisticC3, and on YouTube, just search for Optimistic Curmudgeon. We want to make sure that you have the ability to find and follow all of our content. And then if you're looking at the show description, you'll see links to any resources that were referenced in the show, as well as the sponsors for this episode. Please do check those out. We are very grateful for a variety of different institutions in helping to make this show possible. Until next time, seek the good, enjoy the true, and live the beautiful.